Welcome to this YSL Report Builder tutorial. In this short video, we're going to look at how you can import datasets from SQL query files. We'll start by looking at how to import a basic query file that already exists to generate a new dataset in a Report Builder report. We'll then move on and look at how you can create your own query files, first of all using a basic text editor such as Notepad, and then using a more sophisticated application such as SQL Server Management Studio. For the final short part of the video, we'll look at how to edit existing query files in either Notepad or Management Studio. So let's get started. If you'd like to follow along with this video, you will need a couple of things. First of all, a copy of the file which you can download using the link in this video's description. Once you have it downloaded, you can right-click on it and choose Extract All to extract the compressed files. You don't need to show the extracted files when complete, but I'm going to choose to do that so that I can show you when I click Extract, we end up with a single file called oscarwinningfilms.sql. As well as that file, you'll need a copy of the YSL Movies database as well. If you don't already have that installed, we have a video which explains how to get it set up, and there's a link in that video's description which you can use to download any needed files. Assuming you've got all those things, we can head over to a brand new Report Builder report and start by creating a connection to the YSL Movies database. So I'll right click on my Data Sources folder in the Report Data window and choose Add Data Source. I'll call this one Movies. I'll use an embedded connection pointing to our Microsoft SQL Server. Click the Build button so that I don't have to type in my connection string. And then the shortcut to the local host, which is a /, followed by the name of the instance of SQL Server I'm going to connect to, which in my case is SQL 2017. I can then, from the drop-down list towards the bottom of the dialog box, select my Movies database, click OK a couple of times, and there's my data source created. Now I can create a dataset by importing the file that I've just extracted. I'll right-click on my Movies data source and choose to add a dataset first. I'll change the dataset name so that it's called Oscar Winners, and then rather than typing in a query or using the query designer to build it, I'm going to click the Import button at the bottom of the screen to import the file that I've just extracted. I'll browse over to my desktop and then double click the folder into which I've extracted that file. And then I simply need to double click on the file to extract the contents of it. So that file contained a single select statement. It lists out a set of columns from various different tables in my Movies database joined together. There's a where clause which shows only films with at least one Oscar win, and an order by clause that sorts the results in a particular order. As soon as I click OK, that dataset will be populated. I can see all the columns appear in the Report Data window, and that really is all there is to importing an SQL query file. It makes sense to check that our query has returned some sensible results, and a fairly easy way to do that is to create a table in the report to display the contents of the dataset. Let's just tidy up a little first by deleting the placeholder title text box, and then I'm going to right-click in the page footer and choose to remove that. I'll insert a basic table into the report by right-clicking and choosing Insert Table. And then I can simply assign the columns from my dataset to the various columns of the table. So title, release date, runtime. I don't need to add all of these in here. I'm just going to add in the Oscar nominations and wins as well by dragging those from the dataset and attaching them somewhere to the table based on the position of this vertical blue line. Just to avoid running into the font rendering bug where often the text in the table doesn't actually get displayed, I'm going to highlight all of the cells in the table and then switch from the default font to any other and then simply back to the default font again. I'll change the column widths a little bit to make the titles a little more readable. I'll apply some very basic formatting to the release date to make sure it appears in a sensible way. So with that cell selected, I can click the little dialog box launcher button in the number group on the home tab of the ribbon. And I'll choose a basic date format, something like so. Finally, I'll just format the column headers. I'll change the background color of the header row and maybe make the font bold as well. And then if I run the report, it should display a list of the contents returned by that dataset. Using SQL query files is a great way to speed up creating your datasets, particularly if you find yourself using the same basic query time and time again. So let's have a look at how you can create your own SQL query files. The great news is that at a basic level, you don't need any special tools to create an SQL query file. We're going to use Report Builder's Query Designer and a basic text editor like Notepad to build ours. Let's head back to the design view and pretend that we're going to create a brand new data set using the Query Designer. I'll right-click on my movie's data source and choose Add Dataset. I'm not going to bother changing its name, I'm just going to jump straight to the Query Designer by clicking that button at the bottom of the dialog box. I can then select the various columns I want to include, so I'll go to the film table first and choose the title, release date, Oscar nominations and Oscar wins. From the director table I can select the full name, and then let's say from the genre table I'll select the genre as well. I'll add a basic filter to show me all the films that won at least one Oscar, so I can click the Add Filter button towards the bottom right hand corner of the dialog box here. Change the column name so I'm looking at the Oscar wins, and then change the operator so that it's more than or equal to, and then type in a value of 1. Having done that, I can click OK, and then the Query Designer will write out the select statement for me in the query text box. All I'm going to do now is select everything in the query text box and copy that to the clipboard with Ctrl and C. Then I can open up Notepad. I'll have a quick search for that, search for Notepad, and then paste in everything that I've just copied into my brand new Notepad file. All I need to do now is save that file with the appropriate file name extension. So I can head back to the File menu in Notepad, choose Save or Save As. I'll point this to my desktop, and rather than saving this as a text document with a txt extension, I'm going to change it so that it says All Files, and then call this My Query, for lack of a better name. I am going to type in the extension .sql at the end of the file name, so you can see that there clearly, hopefully. And having done so, I'm going to click the Save button, close down Notepad, and then I'm just going to cancel from this dataset entirely because we don't need it. We've got our code saved in an SQL query file. To make use of that, it doesn't, of course, have to be in the same report. We could have a brand new report created, but just to save a bit of time to avoid having to recreate a new report in the data source, I'm going to right-click on my movies data source and choose to add a dataset. I'll call it My Query, if I can spell it correctly, there we go, and then click the Imports button, look on my desktop, and import the My Query file. So I just get back what I've constructed previously, but of course this query will now be available to any future report that I create. So if I click OK, I'll see the column list is populated, and I could create another table or other report item to display it. Creating query files in the way we just have is certainly quick and easy, but it's also a little limited. Firstly, by the limited nature of the Query Designer in Report Builder. Secondly, by the plain text editor that we're using, Notepad. If we want to get a bit more help with constructing our query files, we can use a different application entirely. And I'm going to show you a quick example of using SQL Server Management Studio to generate our query files. You may well have used Management Studio in the past, and we have several videos which explain how to get it set up. We've got a couple of playlists, one for SQL Server 2016, which explains how to install it and use it, one for SQL Server 2017, which explains the same thing. The actual application itself is incredibly simple to install. There's a quick link there to the Microsoft Docs website, and that has links to download the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio, which is the one that I'm going to use here. I'm not going to get into too much detail about writing SQL queries from scratch. We do have a completely separate playlist which takes you from start to finish through how to write SQL queries. Here we're going to rely on the Query Designer in SQL Server Management Studio. To get that open, I'm going to head back to search for an application and type in SQL Server Management Studio or SQL Server, and that's sufficient to make this application appear. And if I click to launch it, it will eventually appear. So I'm working with the latest version as of today's date. When it loads, I'll need to connect to an instance of SQL Server. So you might be able to make out that in this dialog box is the same that I typed in to connect to my movies data source. So /SQL 2017. If I click the connect button, that will then connect to that instance of SQL Server. And eventually on the left-hand side, I'll end up with a list of databases that I can use to build my queries with. I'm just going to expand the databases folder and select my movies database. And then I need to create a new query. I can do this in several ways. There's a new query button on the top toolbar. I can also press Ctrl and N. Alternatively, I can right-click on the movies database and choose New Query. That will just open up a big empty text page, basically like a Notepad file, if you want to think of it in those terms, but there are quite a few advantages of writing SQL or modifying SQL code in this application. The good news is we don't need to learn how to write SQL queries from scratch. We can use a query designer in Management Studio, but the designer in Management Studio is a little easier to work with. It's a little more powerful, I think, than the one in Report Builder. To launch it, I'm going to first of all make sure that I've got the movies database selected in this drop-down list at the top. Then I can right-click in the background of that query file page and choose Design Query in Editor. When I do that, that will load the query designer in Management Studio. I immediately get asked which tables I'd like to include in the query. So I'm going to go with the same range of tables I selected previously. I'm going to go with the film table first. And then I'm also going to have the director table and the genre table as well. Once I've selected those tables, I can click Close. If I had forgotten to include any tables or I wanted to add an extra one, I can right-click into this diagram view at the top of the query designer and choose Add Table and then include any additional ones. So let's include the studio as well. I'll close down the Add Table window and then I can simply start ticking boxes for the columns I'd like to select. So I can go to the film table first and select the title and the release date. And then if I scroll down towards the bottom of that list of fields, I can choose the Oscar nominations and the Oscar wins as well. From the director table, I'm going to include the full name. From the genre table, the genre. From the studio table, the studio. I can then use the table in the middle of the dialog box to modify things like column aliases and apply sorting and filters. So for example, if I wanted to assign a name to the full name column to make it more obvious what it is the full name of, I can click into the alias column next door to full name and type in something more descriptive. So I'll call this director name. I can include spaces if I like, but I'm not going to bother. Once I've done that, if I click away from that box, that will assign an alias to that column. You can probably see that the entire query is being written out for us in the box at the bottom. You can edit this directly if you like, but it's so much easier just to use the tools at the top of the dialog box to modify things. I would like to sort my query results in order of Oscar nominations first, then Oscar wins, and then by title. So I'm going to change the sort type for the Oscar nominations field to descending order, and then for Oscar wins in descending order, and then for title in ascending order. Because of the order in which I've selected those columns, that's determined the precedence of sorting in the sort order column. You can see that it's going to go by nominations first, then by wins, and then by title. You can happily modify that sort order just by modifying the numbers here, but I'm going to leave mine as they are. Finally, I just want to make sure that I've got my films, only films that have won at least one Oscar. So in the filter column next to the Oscar wins row, I'm going to type in greater than or equal to 1. And then if I just click onto the next line, I can see that it's added a where clause to the query. So it shows only films with at least one Oscar win. At this point, all I need to do is click OK, and that will write the query I've generated into the query page. To test that it gives me the results I want, I can choose to execute the query. So there's an execute button, or I can press the F5 key on the keyboard. And when I do that, I'll see the results appear in the results grid at the bottom of the page. Finally, I'm just going to save this query to my desktop. So I can hit the save button, or I can press Ctrl and S. Bear in mind that I'm only saving the select statement. I'm not actually saving the results of the query here. It's just the select statement that I'm saving. So I'll hit the save button. I'll point to my desktop. I'll call this, I'll call it SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio query. And then I can hit the save button, and then that's it. I've got my query file available. I can now use that saved query file to create a dataset in my Report Builder report. So let's head back there first, and I'm going to right click on my movies data source again and choose Add Dataset. I'll call this one SSMS query, making sure I don't use spaces in the dataset name. Click the Imports button, point once again to my desktop, select my SSMS query that I've just created, and you'll see that the entire query text has been written into the query text box. If I click OK, that generates my new dataset with all of the available columns. I can also make changes to the design of my query in SQL Server Management Studio. If I head back to that application, I can use the Query Designer to do this as long as I've selected the entire query. So I can click and drag with the mouse to select it, or press Ctrl and A on the keyboard for Select All. Having done that, I can right-click on any of the selected text and choose Design Query in Editor to get back everything that I've previously done. I can then make any changes that I like, so I could insert an extra table by right-clicking into the background of the query and choose Add Table. I can then insert, let's go for the certificate table, close down the Add Table window, and then tick the certificate column. Again, I can make any further changes to this query by modifying it either in the table in the middle of the dialog box or manually in the text editor here. I'll click OK to update those changes. I can also add extra columns or remove existing columns by modifying the text. Adding columns is nice in the in SQL Server Management Studio because you get a bit of help when you're writing your query, unlike you would in Notepad or in Report Builder. So let's head to the end of my select list. So the last column I've just created is certificate.certificate. To add an extra column, I'll need to type in a comma at the end of that list. I don't have to write this as a single continuous line, by the way. I can happily break this up onto multiple different lines. So I'm actually going to type in Enter to give myself a new line, and then hit the Tab key to indent my code a couple of spaces. I can also zoom in a bit. If I hold down my Control key and roll the mouse wheel forwards, it makes it a little easier for you to see what's going on. So let's say I wanted to include an extra column from my film table. Let's say the runtime minutes. I can start typing in the name of my table, film, and you'll see I get a bit of help immediately with this IntelliSense list. So I don't have to type in the remaining word film. You can see that it's highlighted with this little blue outline. To type in the rest of that word, I can just hit the Tab key on my keyboard. If I then type in a full stop, that provides me with a list of columns which belong to that table. And if I begin typing in the one that I'm interested in, runtime minutes, when that one's highlighted in the list and it's got the blue outline, I can just hit the Tab key again to type in the rest of that. I also get help if I make mistakes. For instance, if I typed in an extra comma that wasn't required, you can see I get a little red squiggly. Apparently that's an official Microsoft term, red squiggly, which I quite like. So you can see that I've got a mistake and I can't run this query. I don't get any such help in Notepad, of course, or in Report Builder's query text box. So I'll take away that comma. I can execute this query again just to check that it returns my extra couple of columns. I should get a certificate and a runtime minutes column now, so I can execute that, and indeed I do. And then I can save that file to update the definition of my SQL file. Of course, that won't actually affect the data set in Report Builder. The import is very much like a copy, paste values, if you think of it in those terms. So if I wanted to update my query, what I'd need to do is right-click on SSMS query, choose Dataset Properties, and then choose Import again. I can point back to my desktop, point back to my SSMS query, give it a double click, and that will overwrite the previous version of that file. When I click OK, You'll see that the 2 new columns have been added to my dataset, and I can then make use of those in my report. Just finally, it's worthwhile knowing that you can use all of these tools interchangeably. I can use Notepad to open up files created in SQL Server Management Studio, and vice versa. I'm going to head back to Management Studio first, and then close down the file that I've just created. Then I'm going to navigate back to my desktop by holding down the Windows key and pressing D, rather than manually minimizing all of my windows one by one. Then I can find my SSMS query, right-click on it and choose Open With, and then I can choose Notepad from the list. So you'll see that that opens up in a simple text file, and I can happily make changes to it there. Of course, I won't get any help if I make any mistakes, but it's possible to do, and then I could save that file and it will have updated the query. Likewise, I could open up the original file we created, or the one that we generated called My Query. I could go back to SQL Server Management Studio, and I can choose to open a file by either clicking the Open File button or pressing Ctrl and O. I'll click the button, browse to my desktop, and then open up the My Query file by double-clicking on it. So, although that was created in Notepad initially, or in a Report Builder's Query Designer and then saved in Notepad, I can happily now edit this using SQL Server Management Studio, and it's a little bit more neatly laid out than the results from SQL Server Management Studio's Query Designer. So I could perhaps add a new column after Oscar wins, type in a new comma, followed by film, full stop, and then run time minutes. Hit the tab key to type in the remainder of that column name, and then I could simply save the changes I've made. So there we go, a few basic ideas for generating and using SQL query files, which will hopefully speed up creating datasets. Hope you found some of that useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.